Alright guys, this will be our first video for Thursday, March 19th for AP European History. This is the last slide we left off with yesterday, talking about the technology and how it shifted and altered the war. Machine guns, poison gas, barbed wire, tanks, airplanes, submarines, all of which used for the first time in warfare and completely altering how war is fought. So we're moving on to a new slide today. We're now looking at protest and insurrection during the war itself. So we'll look at some kind of generalities at first. So stalemate on the battlefield demoralized lots of troops, both Eastern and Western Front. So Eastern Front on the Russian side as well as the Western Front. A lot of stalemate demoralized the troops. On both sides, soldiers began to feel abandoned by their leaders. Some men mutinied and openly refused to fight. This was especially the case on the Russian side. Over time, they felt like they were being very poorly led, and they began to mutiny. Others began to sabotage equipment or to desert their posts altogether. All right, so we first look at the Battle of Asni in 1917. This is one of the largest mutinies of the entire war. It is in France. French soldiers in 136 regiments refused to man the front lines. They were so tired of doing these charges and nothing ever changing. After 3 years of fighting, it led to thousands deserting. So 136 regiments, which means thousands of men, refused to man the front lines, and thousands deserted. Around 40,000 men participated in a mutiny, meaning that they try to disobey the orders of their superiors and try to go against them. General Henri Pétain, P-E-T-A-I-N, General Henri Pétain, brought the rebellion to a halt and executed about 26 of the leaders of the revolt itself. The rest returned to fight, so they were able to stave off the rebellion or the mutiny there. But that's an example of the giant rebellion on the Western Front. At the same time, you have Ireland trying to break off as well too. Ireland, frustrated from the home rule not panning out for them, they don't want to be part of this war. They want to get out. For decades, the Irish had sought home rule, but thousands of Irish did enlist to fight alongside the British. So you did see Irish fight alongside the British with the Allied powers. Heavy losses in the trenches of the Irish increased resentment at home because this wasn't their war. They wanted to be out from the British shadow anyway, so it just made the push for rebellion even stronger. Many Irish came to believe the British had no intention of honoring the Irish Home Rule Bill once the war was ended, especially because they needed people to fight in the war itself. On April 23rd, 1916, so this is right in the middle of the war, and on Easter Sunday, hence the name Easter Rebellion. So April 23rd, 1916, on Easter Sunday, a rebellion broke out in Dublin, Ireland. A week of street fighting between Irish rebels and British troops ended with the uprising being crushed. So a week of street fighting between the Irish rebels and British troops ended up with the uprising being crushed. 1,350 were killed and wounded. So 1,350 were killed or wounded. 15 rebel leaders were executed for this rebellion. So finally, when the war ended, though, in 1922, a treaty finally divided Ireland into two separate states. Ireland, or the Free Irish State, which is the majority of the country, like in the south and the central part of the island, becomes independent. British Northern Ireland remains with the United Kingdom to this day. Even though they split up into two countries finally, and they finally get home rule, there's still a lot of fighting over Ireland as far as should it be united or not, and so that conflict still even happens up until recent modern times. All right, then you have the Russian Revolution. We're going to talk a lot more about this in its aftermath, but just kind of a quick little glimpse at this. So Russia, the Russian side of the war with Germany left the country very drained and impoverished. A lot of workers went on strike back home. They were not really well equipped at all. They were way too... or not really at all industrialized to fight this war, so they were really struggling. At one point, the Tsar at the time, Tsar Nicholas II, you can see his picture right here, Tsar Nicholas II actually went to the front lines to try to lead the forces towards 1917, thinking that he could help rally the troops and help to get their spirits and morale turned around, but it just failed completely. And so the Tsar returned home after failing to try to get his soldiers' morale boosted. He was unable to establish order whenever he got back to the Russian government in St. Petersburg. And so because of the strikes and because of the uprisings taking place in his home capital, in March of 1917, he abdicates and turns over the government to a provisional democratic government. So that's key. It's not communist. It's a provisional democratic government. So he does abdicate because things were coming apart back home. However, the new government had very weak leadership as well, and they insisted on continuing the war. One of the main reasons why they were revolting is that they wanted out the war. A lot of the Russians wanted the war to end immediately, and the new government thought, okay, if they rework how they're doing it, they could continue to fight and be successful, and that was not the case. And so they're going to, stupidly, they're going to continue the war effort, and they're going to make a lot of the same mistakes in the summer of 1917 to the point to where there's going to be a second revolution that year. So that first revolution, sometimes called the February Revolution because their calendar's off in Russia. Then you have the second revolution later on, the October Revolution, which actually took place in November. So later that same year, the Bolshevik Party, which is the Communist Party, seized power, led by Vladimir Lenin. You can see a picture of him right here. So Vladimir Lenin led the communists to overthrow the provisional government and establish a new communist government instead. So long story short there, that by January, the Russians had developed a treaty called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, BREST-LITOVSK, I believe. They withdrew from the war completely. They actually, and I'll come back to this later on, they actually ceded a whole bunch of territory in Eastern Europe to the Germans. So the Germans actually technically got a bunch of territory out of the deal, but even though they try to fight the war on, they're not going to win with the Allies, and once America shows up as well. All right, now moving on to World War I as a global conflict. So the war in Europe quickly spread to the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia. So it's not just, we don't often hear about all the global aspects of this war in U.S. history, but there were different fronts being fought in Africa, Asia, and in the Middle East. Japan declares war on Germany because they see an opportunity, so they begin to seize Germany's colonies in China and other places around Asia. So while Germany couldn't defend itself, Japan declares war on Germany, begins to seize a bunch of its territories in general during the war itself. Arabs also revolted after because they wanted to break off from the Ottoman Empire. So I don't know if you can tell this on this map, but basically Ottoman Empire is where Turkey is, and you have a bunch of Arabs that are living down here, what's now Saudi Arabia. They wanted their own independence, so they began to break off and try to be free of the Ottoman control at the same time. So the Ottoman Empire, we fought fighting World War I at the same time, trying to put down this Arab revolt in the Arabian Peninsula. By 1915, this was becoming more and more of a true global conflict. So we're going to first look at the Armenian genocide. The Armenian genocide, which a lot of times they like to cover up in the Middle East. In 1915, the Ottoman government began a systematic program to seize Armenian land and deport Armenians from Turkey. So by 1915, the Ottoman government began a systematic program to seize Armenian land and deport Armenians from Turkey. The Armenians were a Christian minority who lived mainly in northeast Turkey. Turkey's rulers saw the Armenians as traitors, poised to betray the Muslim-led empire to gain regional autonomy. So Turkey's rulers saw the Armenians as traitors, poised to betray the Muslim-led empire to gain regional autonomy. In truth, the Armenians were just a scapegoat for their problems, and they had been long regarded with suspicion. Kind of like the Jews were longtime scapegoats for Europeans, and for Christian Europeans, that Armenians were kind of scapegoats for these Muslims in Turkey. Ottoman authorities encouraged ethnic Turks to rise up against their Armenian neighbors. So the Ottoman authorities of the government encouraged the ethnic Turks to rise up against their Armenian neighbors. Many were murdered outright, while others died of hunger, thirst, and disease. So in the genocide, many were murdered outright, while others were just others died because of hunger, thirst, and disease. Especially once they were forced to march from their homes to camps in the deserts of Syria and Iraq. So a lot of them died from disease or thirst or hunger when they were forced to march out of their homeland. Between 1915 and 1916, about 1 million Armenians or more died. We don't know the exact number, but there was a bunch of Armenians killed. They're still around as a people today, but they are greatly depleted because of all this. We're going to stop video 1 there.